Tolkien's influence on the fantasy genre is incomparable. Both of John, the original J.R.R., and his son, Christopher, has changed the face of what we know as the fantasy world build. The understanding, the detail, the level of meticulous planning that he put into Middle-earth and the sketches that led up to it and followed after have inspired role-playing games and novels across the world. But Tolkien spent years, decades, meticulously planning this world out, going day after day, venturing into different corners, writing out different stories, examining characters and themes and histories over and over and over again. And so while I, of all people, would never consider anyone to be better than Tolkien, only different, what can we learn from the work that he put in over decades, particularly when it comes to maps? Hello adventurers, my name is Ryan. Welcome back to the Red Quills. Today we're going to be talking about Tolkien, the world-famous world builder. He's arguably the most famous fantasy author in history, and the techniques that he used in creating his maps we can use in creating our own fantasy worlds. Now, I'm not saying that we can all be like Tolkien was, but we could certainly learn from what he did to create not only Middle-earth, but the worlds that began with the collections of disparate papers back in the Book of Lost Tales, all the way through to Christopher Tolkien's adaptations of his later works. The world of Middle-earth is arguably one of the most famous fantasy worlds in human history. And it's a rubric, not only for me personally, but also for the Western fantasy genre as a whole. Everything that we know about the fantasy genre today is either built upon or inspired by Tolkien and what he did, and especially role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons have taken their cues from what he created in his series of novels, starting with The Hobbit and moving on to later works. Despite the fact that the most famous maps of Middle-earth are, of course, the map of Middle-earth at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings and Thror's map in The Hobbit, Tolkien himself collected a vast number of other maps that he used throughout his writings, from the unpublished works earlier on to the maps that Christopher Tolkien would later publish to pair with the Silmarillion. Tolkien loved all things map making, and he used the inspiration from his maps before he even started writing. So the first tip that we can take from Tolkien is this: make your map before you write your story. Doing so allows you to not only understand where you're going and what to expect, but allows you to understand what kind of stories you're telling. Beginning with a map of something as simple as the world's creation or a visualization of the world as a boat, you can come up with any number of other mythologies for your world. A picture is worth 1,000 words. A map, even more so. It seems almost silly to say that Tolkien hand-drew all of his maps, and that's the second fact that I'm going to work with in terms of how we can learn from Tolkien's world building. He didn't really have much of a choice. There wasn't really a digital alternative for him to use. But hand-drawing his maps not only allowed him to create the world under his own control, as opposed to getting someone else to do it for him, but it meant that he had to think about every aspect of world building as he created the maps. Hand-drawing your own worlds immerses you in the landscape, makes sure that you understand every detail, every corner of the page before you ever pick up a pen. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone to find that Tolkien is by nature a rather meticulous kind of fellow. He was perfectly precise about exact distances, measured everything in excruciating detail, and even made sure that when he measured out distances on his maps, he used leagues, not miles, not kilometers, in order to further immerse the world in a history and a world building. In order to follow along with that train of thought, with keeping to that level of exactitude and detail and meticulous planning, he used graph paper for all of his sketches, often working in the exercise books that he would use at university. Tolkien was no stranger to updates. In fact, he not only embraced them, he made use of them. When he released the first edition of The Hobbit, he changed it later on so that when he could release The Lord of the Rings, more of the details of the original story matched with that of the latest story, and his maps are no different. When he created his world, He began by creating sketches. Only later on did he update, did he add more and more ideas, more and more concepts into the world, so that when he had finished, not only was it far more detailed than it was originally, he could adapt ideas as he went on, retroactively changing things to match the story, so that what we have now is far more detailed than the original sketches. Tolkien considered allegory to be a particularly lazy way of conveying storytelling ideas. He didn't like direct translations from reality into fiction. He thought that it was a more elegant solution to incorporate ideas into the world building, so that you didn't have to use a straight cut metaphor or a simile in order to understand your ideas. And maybe that's why when he created Middle-earth, despite the fact that it is supposed to be the history of Europe and the Middle East, as told by a different sort of narrator, he didn't match any of the tectonics, any of the mountain ranges, to what can be found in our own world. There are some parallels, but overall he used Middle-earth as an allegory, and the locations that he put on the map are therefore metaphorical. They represent ideas, rather than direct geographical parallels. So when you create your own map, you can use the same kind of ideas. Instead of just making a world that's precisely like our own, you can do what Tolkien did. You can ask yourself, what does a large dark forest represent? What does the land of Mordor mean in the story and to the readers? What is something like the Shire, or the wastes of Rohan, or the ruins you can find in Gondor? It all adds something to the storytelling, and when you create your own world, you can use those ideas as well. And the last of the facts that we can take away from Tolkien's maps in particular are his use of language. He was a linguist by trade. He loved all things language, and you can see that he used that in his maps. In the maps of The Hobbit, there was a decidedly more anglicized trend. All of the names are much more English or even Old English than they are in later versions. The Hobbit uses the map of Thror, which has, for instance, things like the Lonely Mountain, the Running River, the Desolation of Smaug, all names which incorporate English words and a method of naming that is entirely anglicized. However, later maps, the ones of Middle-earth, he switched to other languages, to the dialects of Elven that he had later on, and to the languages of the dwarves and the men, so that you have words like Lorien and Eregion, which are both have their linguistic roots in a language that is not only not of our own world, but not of the world of the Hobbit. Okay, so what can we learn from Tolkien about world building and map making? Well, we know we need to make the map first. When creating your world, be sure that you know what locations you're working with at the beginning. It doesn't need to be the map you have later on, but it needs to be a map before you put pen to paper, before you start planning a campaign. 2, hand draw your maps. You can use digital programs if you want to, but I would recommend, and so would Tolkien, sitting down and putting pen to paper yourself, at least for the planning stages. It might not look tidy, it might not look good, but it doesn't need to. It just needs to be a tool to help you world build. 3, be exact about what's on your map. Use graph paper if you need to, but measure things meticulously. Be sure you know whether the roads that have been made on the face of the world are the shortest direct routes, where the rivers flow is the gentlest path, how wide the mountains are at the base. These details will come up if you world build to any level of sophistication, so be sure that you think about them when you make your map. But 4, don't be afraid to update your map as you go on, just like Tolkien did. Add details, change things, reconstitute your world to suit your own endeavors. 5, think about what the map represents. Don't just worry about making a world that's real, that follows all the rules, that has all the physical understandings of the world. That's not the most important part. The most important part is that you tell a story. Tell the story first, make sure everything has a meaning, and then come along later on and tidy up as you go. And 6, the most important, most Tolkienian bit of advice anyone could possibly give you, think about language. When you make your map, what do they speak? Is the language of the perspective of the person who makes the map, or are these place names widely recognized as being their own? And like Tolkien did, have translations of those names in your map. Tolkien has them in all of his maps so that you understand what places are, what they have been called in the past or are called by different peoples. Add that level of world building into your maps. And that brings us to the end of this video. Tolkien is by far one of the most famous, if not the most famous and influential world builder in the history of, well, history. He's the inspiration for Dungeons and Dragons and the Western fantasy genre as a whole, and you can't really get away from that. But we can learn from what he's done, even if we can't expect ourselves to be as good as he ever was. But if you follow his example, if you learn to world build using the examples that he left behind, then you won't make your own Middle-earth, but you will make a world that you love as much as he loved his own. Thanks for watching this time, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments. I know that Tolkien has left such a legacy everywhere that everyone must have their own opinions on his maps and their world building. I've tried to keep this video fairly short for ease of digestion, but if you have anything more that you want me to talk about, or if you want to talk about anything, stick it in the comments below, or come on to the Red Quills Discord and share your thoughts and ideas. If you want to download some of the maps that I've created in the past, you can go onto the Red Quills Patreon. Everything's there for free, and you can see what else I'm working on in the meantime. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.